All right, Algebra 1B students. Welcome to part 1 of lesson 11.2. In this video, we're going to be taking rational expressions that we talked about in our last couple videos, and we're going to start multiplying them together, just like we multiply fractions regularly in math class. We multiply the tops of the fractions, we multiply the bottoms of the fractions, but we're going to do a couple things here before we try to do that when we're dealing with rational expressions instead of fractions. All right. So the first type of fraction that you're going to see is something just like this, where you have two fractions and they're mostly normal, except now one of them or both of them involve variables. So what we're going to do here is multiply these two together by just multiplying the tops and bottoms. The top, of course, ends up being negative 12. The bottom here, a squared times a to the third, we add those exponents together and we get a to the fifth power. So that's my final answer here, negative 12 over a to the fifth power. Okay, and that's a relatively simple version of what we're going to be talking about today. So in cases where it's just numbers and variables, no plus signs or minus signs or anything like that, you can just multiply across. Of course, you should look out for opportunities to cancel things or to reduce these fractions in the end. But mostly we're going to see reducing and canceling things in this next type of problem. Okay, so if there's no plus or minus signs, don't worry about anything. Just multiply the tops and bottoms and then cancel some things out if you can. All right. Now, the type of problem that we need to worry about more is something like this, where we have a bit crazier looking rational expressions here that we need to deal with, and at least one of either numerator or denominator on each of the fractions being multiplied can be factored. So, step one, when we do this, step one is factor everything. Okay? Factor everything is step one. So what that means is try to factor out a common factor, or if you have a quadratic equation or expression like this guy, we want to factor it into those two parenthesis pieces using our rules of multiply to negative 10, add up to 3. Of course, the top left, or the top of the first fraction, is just x plus 5. That cannot be factored. The bottom is 7x minus 21, and that can be factored into 7, and then in parentheses, x minus 3. So that's the first fraction. X plus 5 over 7 times x minus 3. And that's being multiplied by a fraction where the top can't be factored. It's just 14x's. That's just the way it is. And the bottom of the fraction is a quadratic that I need to factor into two parentheses pieces. So I will factor the bottom by trying to find two numbers that add up to be negative 10, right? And multiply to be negative 10 and add up to be a positive 3. Multiply to be negative 10, add up to be positive 3. Those two numbers would be a positive 5 and a negative 2. So x minus 2 right there. Okay. So these are now my two fractions once I factored everything, and now I'm going to multiply the tops and bottoms. But first, I'm going to cancel anything that I see that's the same. Well, right here on the top of this fraction, I have x plus 5. I'm going to cancel that with this x plus 5. And all that's now left on the top is a 14x. And on the bottom, I have 7 times in parentheses x minus 3 times in parentheses x minus 2. Right? And when I have these pieces all multiplied together, I still want to look at the end for things that I can maybe cancel. And I notice on the top I have a 14 as my number. In the bottom I have a 7, and those numbers are being multiplied, of course, by these things with x's. But I can simplify 14 and 7 by dividing both of them by 7, and I end up with on the top a 2 multiplied by my x, And on the bottom, the 7 is just going to go away. When I divide 7 by 7, I get 1. So you can put a 1 times in front of this, or you can just leave it off is also fine. And then in parentheses, also x minus 2. So my final answer here, when I simplify, when I find the product, after I have factored everything, canceled what I can, multiplied across, and then simplified. By the way, I'll add a few more of those steps there. Step 2, cancel things if you can. Step 3, multiply across. But I would say leave the parentheses there. And then step 4 is simplify further if possible. Okay, so make sure those 4 steps get written down. Factor everything, cancel whatever you can, multiply across, but leave things in the parentheses like I did here. So just put all the pieces together as one fraction. That's what multiplying across means. Put it together as one fraction, and then look to simplify things that you can. And once you're done simplifying, if there's nothing else to cancel out, that's done, and you have your simplified form. Okay. Now, all of your problems in your practice problem set are going to look like this, but I do want to make you aware that sometimes you just have a fraction, rational expression, multiplied by something that's not a fraction. Now, when we deal with just numbers, we should remember how we can turn a number like, say, 4. How can we turn that into a fraction? Well, we can put it over 1, right? 4 over 1 is the same as just 4. We don't really need the over 1 there. Now, I can do exactly the same thing here with m squared plus m minus 6. I can put that over 1, and then my process is exactly like it was up above, where I'll do step 1, then step 2, step 3, and so on, right? So what I end up with when I factor, 2m plus 5 can't be factored on the top of that fraction. 3m minus 6 can be factored on the bottom. I end up with 3 parentheses m minus 2 when I divide both of these pieces by 3. Then my other fraction, the top is actually a set of 2 sets of parentheses because it was a quadratic equation. And then the bottom is just going to be a 1 still. So to factor this quadratic here, I need 2 numbers that multiply to be negative 6 and add up to be positive 1 because there is no number in front of that m there. Multiplying to be negative 6 and adding up to be 1 would be a plus 3 and minus 2. And then the bottom, as I mentioned, is just a 1. So now I have these fractions being multiplied together, and I'll multiply tops and bottoms, making everything one fraction as soon as I cancel whatever I see that's the same. And the first thing I notice that's the same is my m minus 2 parentheses is on the top over here and on the bottom over here, so that can cancel out. Now you ask yourself, what's left on the bottom? Well, 3 times 1, that just gives me 3, and then on the top, this 2m plus 5 is like in parentheses, and this m plus 3 is in parentheses, so I will write down 2m plus 5 in parentheses, and then in parentheses m plus 3. Just as a reminder, if something's in parentheses added to something else, you are not allowed to cancel out this 3 with this 3, so I will just leave it the way it is. That's done, and that is as simple as my product can get. So your answers now are going to start to look a little bit more complicated. Just make sure that you cancel out everything that you can after you've factored everything that you can. If you have questions about how to multiply rational expressions and then factor and cancel, or any of those 4 steps I mentioned, please make a note to ask me in class tomorrow. Otherwise, that's all I have for you. Have a wonderful night.